Elvis Presley said it quietly, not like a man making a dramatic statement, but like someone admitting something they'd been holding inside for years. They were alone in a sealed back room at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. Thick walls, no windows, the kind of room designed so nothing inside could ever reach the outside world. Beyond those walls, the building was still alive with noise. Thousands of people were flooding into the casino, high on lights and liquor and the memory of the midnight show. Elvis's name echoed through the corridors, shouted, sung, repeated like a spell that refused to wear off. Inside the room, the man they worshipped looked nothing like the image they'd just applauded. "You're free, Johnny," Elvis said, his voice low and even. "I never was." Johnny Cash didn't answer right away. He didn't look away. He didn't nod. He simply sat there, letting the sentence settle, trying to understand how it could come from the man sitting across from him. That man was Elvis Presley, the biggest name in music, the face that sold out arenas without trying, the symbol of success so complete it had swallowed the meaning of the word. And yet, here he was, saying he had never been free. For a moment, Cash assumed it was exhaustion talking. Elvis had just finished another midnight performance, the same one he'd been performing night after night. Same songs, same pacing, same jokes delivered at precisely the same moments. 2 shows a night, 6 nights a week, every seat filled, every ending met with thunderous applause that came before the last note even faded. From the outside, it looked like control at the highest level. From this close, it felt like something else entirely. Cash had heard the whispers before coming to Vegas. Musicians talked quietly when they thought no one important was listening. Crew members lowered their voices in hallways. Pills to wake up, pills to calm the nerves, pills to sleep. People around Elvis who smiled constantly, agreed with everything, and never told him no. A schedule that didn't belong to a man anymore. It belonged to a system that demanded constant output and never paused to ask what it was costing. Still, Cash hadn't planned on seeing him. He hadn't reached out. The message had come suddenly, delivered through people who didn't ask questions. Elvis wanted to talk. And you didn't refuse a request like that, even if you didn't know why it had been made. The room itself was plain, almost clinical. A couch pushed against one wall, 2 chairs facing each other, a small table holding bottled water and a half-empty glass of whiskey. Elvis was still in his white jumpsuit, the collar slightly open, the fabric clinging faintly to his skin from sweat. His hair was perfect in the way only constant maintenance could achieve, but his eyes were somewhere else, unfocused, as if his body had stayed behind while his mind wandered far ahead. At first, they talked about nothing that mattered. Vegas crowds, old musicians, stories from early days, back when everything felt possible and nothing felt permanent. The conversation moved easily, but it never settled. It circled something heavier, something neither of them named, but both felt pressing closer with every passing minute. Eventually, Elvis leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure," Cash replied. "How do you do it?" Cash frowned slightly. "Do what?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then leaned back and stared at the ceiling, as if the words were written somewhere above him and he needed time to read them. "How do you stay yourself?" The question landed harder than anything else he'd said. This wasn't about money, or charts, or even music. Elvis wasn't asking how to survive the business. He was asking how to survive being Elvis Presley. "I wake up every day," Elvis said, his voice steady but stripped of performance, "and I put on a costume. I walk out on that stage and I become what they expect. I sing the songs they want. I move the way they want. I say the lines they want." He stopped, letting the silence stretch. And when I walk off that stage, I don't know who I am anymore. Cash felt something tighten in his chest. He'd fought addiction. He'd fought his past. He'd fought himself more times than he could count. But this was different. Elvis wasn't fighting anything. He was stuck. "You think I'm free," Cash said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I know you are," Elvis replied without hesitation. "And you're not." Elvis looked at him directly this time. No smile, no charm, no performance left to hide behind. "I never was." Cash didn't argue. For the first time, he couldn't find a counterpoint, because sitting across from him wasn't a king enjoying his throne. It was a man realizing far too late that he'd built a prison out of applause and only now understood that the door might never open. And Cash didn't yet know how deeply that realization was going to follow him. The silence after Elvis's words didn't feel empty. It felt crowded. Johnny Cash noticed it immediately. The way the room seemed to shrink once the truth had been spoken out loud. The air conditioning hummed softly, steady and mechanical, like it had no idea something important had just happened. Somewhere far below, slot machines rang out an artificial celebration. Laughter drifted up from the casino floor. Life was moving on exactly as it always did. Inside that room, time slowed. Cash shifted slightly in his chair. He'd spent most of his life dealing with men who hid behind bravado or anger. Elvis was doing neither. There was no self-pity in his voice, no bitterness, just a calm awareness that scared Cash more than emotion ever could. "When did it happen?" Cash asked finally. "When did you stop being able to choose?" Elvis didn't answer right away. He rubbed his palms together slowly, as if warming them, a small restless habit Cash hadn't seen before. "I don't think there was a moment," Elvis said. "That's the thing. If there'd been one big moment, I might have noticed." He leaned back in his chair. It was little stuff, things that didn't feel dangerous. Sign this contract, do this movie, don't argue, don't disappear. Keep the schedule tight, keep everyone happy. He let out a short breath. "And then one day I woke up and realized I wasn't driving anymore. I was just sitting there, hands off the wheel, watching the road go by." Cash nodded slowly. He knew that feeling. The difference was he'd learned how to pull over. Elvis never had. "Why don't you stop? Take time off, cancel a run, do something different?" Elvis smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Because I don't belong to myself anymore," he said. "If I stop, it's not just me who falls. It's everyone around me." That was the truth most people never saw. Elvis Presley wasn't just a man. He was a schedule, a payroll, a promise. Every person in his orbit depended on the image staying exactly the same. The moment it cracked, everything else followed. "They don't want me to find out who I am without this, because if I do, the whole thing collapses." Cash felt a chill run through him. This wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. "You envy me," Cash said quietly. Elvis didn't hesitate. "I do." "Not the music," Cash continued. "Not the fame. No, your freedom." That word hung between them, heavier now than it had earlier. Elvis wasn't tired of singing. He wasn't tired of performing. He was tired of being owned by an idea that grew larger than the person it came from. Cash thought about his own career, the deals he'd walked away from, the times he'd disappeared when people wanted more, the moments he'd paid a price for staying difficult, unpredictable, real. He'd always thought of those choices as compromises. Sitting here, he saw them for what they really were: escape routes. "I don't know how to help you," Cash said after a long pause. "I'm not asking you to," Elvis replied. "I just needed someone to hear it, someone who'd understand." "And you think I do?" "I know you will," Elvis said. "Maybe not tonight, but someday." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, like the conversation had crossed the line it couldn't step back over. Anything else they said would only dilute it. Finally, Elvis stood up. Cash followed. "Take care of yourself, Cash," Elvis said, extending his hand. "Don't let them turn you into something you're not." Cash shook his hand. "I'll try." Elvis nodded, already distant again. Cash walked out of the room and into the hallway, swallowed instantly by noise and movement. Neon lights, voices, laughter. Las Vegas doing what it always did, pretending nothing ever had consequences. At the time, Cash told himself Elvis was exaggerating, that exhaustion and pills had darkened his perspective, that things could change if he wanted them to. But even as he walked away, one thought kept circling in his mind. Elvis hadn't sounded like a man imagining a future. He'd sounded like someone who already knew how his story ended. For years, Johnny Cash didn't think about that night in Las Vegas the way he should have. Life moved on. Tours came and went. Records were made, ignored, rediscovered. Cash struggled, fell, got back up again. Addiction, recovery, faith, doubt, all of it blurred together the way life does when you're still inside it. And through all of that, the memory of Elvis's words stayed somewhere in the background. Not loud, not demanding, just waiting. "You're free, Johnny. I never was." At the time, Cash told himself Elvis had been tired, overworked, surrounded by too many voices, too many expectations. Cash believed, or maybe needed to believe, that things could still change, that Elvis could step away if he truly wanted to, that no one was ever completely trapped. That belief made the memory easier to live with. Then came 1977. The news reached Cash the same way it reached everyone else, abruptly, without ceremony. Elvis Presley dead, found alone in his bathroom at Graceland. 42 years old, the biggest name in music reduced to a headline that felt too small to carry its weight. Johnny Cash didn't cry at first. He didn't react the way people expected. There was no shock, no disbelief, just a slow, sinking recognition that tightened in his chest as the day went on. He thought about that room in Las Vegas, the thick walls, the quiet voice, the way Elvis hadn't sounded angry or afraid, just certain. Only then did the meaning finally land. Elvis hadn't been asking for help that night. He hadn't been looking for advice or sympathy. He'd already understood something most people never do until it's too late. That success, once it reaches a certain size, stops being something you control. It becomes something that controls you. Cash began to see it everywhere after that. Artists who couldn't stop touring even when their bodies begged them to. Performers who couldn't change their sound without risking everything. People who confused applause with approval and approval with freedom. Elvis had been trapped by an image so powerful it erased the man underneath it. Cash looked back at his own life with new eyes. The moments he'd once seen as mistakes or missed opportunities began to rearrange themselves. The deals he'd turned down because they felt wrong. The times he'd disappeared when the industry wanted more. The periods where he'd been written off as difficult, unstable, unreliable. He'd always thought those moments were failures. Now he understood they were exits. Some people build careers, others build cages without realizing it. Elvis had built one so large the world mistook it for a kingdom. Cash never spoke publicly about that conversation. It didn't feel like his story to tell. But whenever journalists asked him about Elvis later in life, Cash always paused before answering. A noticeable pause, long enough that people leaned in. Elvis was the best, he'd say, but he paid a price most people don't understand. When they asked what price, Cash would shake his head.
because it wasn't something you could explain in an interview. It was something you had to recognize in yourself. Late in his life, a young musician once asked Cash for advice. The kid was talented, ambitious, hungry. He wanted to know how to make it big, how to become a legend, how to avoid being forgotten. Cash studied him quietly before answering. "You want my advice?" he said. "Figure out who you are before anyone else decides for you. Because once you become what the world needs you to be, you don't get to go back." The kid smiled, nodded, thanked him, the way people do when they don't really understand what they've just been given. Cash wasn't thinking about the kid anymore. He was thinking about Elvis, about that night, about that confession, about a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered: freedom. Elvis Presley was remembered for his voice, his image, his legacy. Johnny Cash remembered him for something else entirely: the warning he gave in a quiet room when no one else was listening. Because Elvis had been right about one thing: freedom wasn't about success. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about being loved by millions. It was about being able to walk away before what you built started owning you. Elvis never learned how to do that. But that night in Las Vegas, he made sure someone else did.
And Cash carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life, not as regret, not as guilt, but as a reminder every time the world tried to tell him who he should be. "You're free, Johnny." Years later, he finally understood why. Because Elvis never was.